Hey, it's Matthew Cudmore with Story Behind the Stone, podcast about service, sacrifice, and story. We are coming to you with a really special episode with our guest, Renée Davis, with the Department of National Defense, with the Directorate of History and Heritage, with the Casualty Identification Program. Renée has been working in this area for quite a while. Her day-to-day, very interesting. She is looking to identify unknown soldiers buried in different places around the world, from the First World War, Second World War, Korea. Really enjoyed today's conversation with Renée. Thanks for coming on, Renée, and thank you for tuning in.
Welcome to Story Behind the Stone, where we talk service, sacrifice, and stories, connecting you to the past and the most interesting people in the field of veteran causes and commemorations. My name is Ryan, along with Matt, and we are with Memory Anchor, a company committed to using technology for good as we work at changing the way the world remembers. Today, we're sitting down with Renée Davis, a research historian with the Casualty Identification Program with the Department of National Defense. Renée, we were talking a little bit to get started, and we have a lot of synergies and some great history that you have, and I can't wait to hear a little more about it.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Renée, you are tuning in from London, United Kingdom. How did you end up there?
So we're doing a short-term deployment. My spouse is posted here, and I asked National Defense if I could tag along. I tried to sell it as having some benefits of me working from here, access to the National Archives, and easy access to hop over the channel and get over to France. So they said yes. So I was very fortunate.
Can you share just a little bit about what the Casualty Identification Program is, just for our listeners to get a little context?
So the Canadian Casualty Identification Program formally was established in 2007, but it stems from a long-running tradition of Canadian military personnel identifying and bearing their own. So the modern iteration of the program works to identify the remains and graves of Canadian service members from the First World War, the Second World War, and the conflict in Korea. And that's because there's still roughly about 28,000 missing service members from those conflicts. And so we are actively working to making sure that we can identify as many as possible so that they can be formally commemorated with their names and honored and recognized for their sacrifice.
It sounds like really busy work. I want to ask a bunch of questions about the nature of your work because it is such a interesting job. However, I want to get a sense of how did you end up doing this? Like what brought you in the field? What's that passion? Because I imagine you have quite a passion for this topic. So where did that come from?
I absolutely do have a passion for it, but I can't say I've always had a passion for it. I was someone who always was interested in history, but was never one to be drawn to military history. I was encouraged by my high school history teacher and my mom to apply to be a guide at the Vimy commemorative site to work as a student guide there. And so in the first year of university, I did so, and I was accepted to work in the summer of 2014, and I absolutely fell in love with it. I fell in love with the site, with the history, with learning about the memorial, with walking through the cemeteries, and more than anything, with actually talking with people that were coming to the sites, learning their stories, learning what motivated them to come. And within weeks, I was just so enthralled to the point where when I went back to university, I studied the war in any way, shape, or form I could.
Wow.
So I just truly fell in love with it. And then at the end of my undergrad, I went back to Vimy to work as the head guide at Vimy during the commemorative period, the centenary. And again, just reinforced how much I loved the sites and the history there. And so I decided to go on and do a master's degree in Canadian military and medical history. And simultaneously through the co-op program, started working at the Directorate of History and Heritage, and weaseled my way into helping with the casualty identification work. And eventually, once I finished with my master's and finished at Vimy, they couldn't really get rid of me if they tried. So I managed to get a full-time job. And now I, as of this year, work full-time with the Casualty Identification Program. And then I simultaneously go overseas about once a year to train the guides that now work at Vimy and Beaumont Hamel. So the passion is now very, very deep. Even though I can't say I necessarily started out with it, I have just absolutely fallen in love with it.
I think you capture basically the spirit of what that program is about is, getting students to come out to Vimy. And for our listeners who don't know, Vimy is the National World War I monument that has the names of about 11,000 Canadian soldiers that have no known graves, and it is a bit of a pilgrimage point for many Canadians coming overseas. And it sits on the top of the hill at Vimy Ridge, which the Canadians took back in 1917. And there's interpretive guides. You were one of them, and the idea is to get students out and involved in this big part of Canadian history and identity. And you clearly went back to school and made a whole career out of it, which is amazing. And now you're giving back, not just to Canadians who are coming to visit, but these soldiers by identifying their bodies and supporting, that memory of them, but also their family. Can you tell me a little bit of what you love about your current job?
There's honestly so much. It's hard to even find a starting point. I love that I am able to use something that I am passionate about, learning about the First World War, learning about the individual soldier's experience in such a tangible way that has a lasting impression. The fact that I can now spend my days doing what I call historical sleuthing, to kind of comb through these records and go through the war diaries and personnel files and newspapers and all this different stuff, and kind of piece together a story of what happened, and then ultimately put forward a case to identify someone to either help with identifying the remains that were found, or ultimately turn an unknown headstone into an identified headstone. And then, in subsequent months, years, what have you, I can go back to that cemetery and sit at that grave and know that my little bit of research helped bring that. It's just such a fueling for wanting to do more and look at it more. And I think at the end of the day, I'm not the one who ever notifies the family. I'm not the one who kind of deals with that. The Army is the one who actually kind of does all the official notifications and things. But even still, hearing how the family reacts, seeing how much media attention surrounds it, and how positive that impression is and how long lasting it is, I think it's just such a cool way of using history to really make a mark, I guess, to have an impact. So yeah, there's so much I love. Day to day, it's always interesting. Every case is different. They all have their own quirks. They all have lots of frustrations as well. I don't want to say it's all easy. There's many cases that we have to close just because there's not enough evidence. But when we get one where we can call a family and say we found him, it makes it all worth it.
That's really cool. It makes me could you let our listeners know and how that process looks like? So when you look at a soldier, and maybe there's a case you would like to talk a little bit about, but how does it unfold?
So the process kind of varies. We have two different types of cases. So we have what we call an identification of remains cases, and that is where skeletal remains, human remains, are actually found typically from construction projects or people that are going out with metal detectors or anything like that. And that's where there's actual bones that we have to identify. So we have our forensic anthropologist, Dr. Sarah Lockyer, goes overseas, and she does a full analysis of the remains, because we never repatriate back to Canada. We keep them closest to where they fell so that they can be buried next to their fallen. And so we work through that process. We conduct a tremendous amount of historical research in conjunction with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to figure out a list of potential candidates. And then when there's a set of remains, if necessary, we'll take DNA samples. We then have a genealogist, Alexandra McKinnon, that does all the genealogical research to find the next of kin, to ask them for a DNA sample, a little cheek swab, to compare against the DNA that we extract from the remains. Sometimes we have to look at isotope analysis as well. And oftentimes we use the forensic odontology response team to look at dental records and compare them with dental records in the personnel files. So there's lots of different things that are involved in an identification of remains case. And then ultimately, if we are able to successfully identify, we'll put the case forward to the Casualty Identification Review Board. It's like our peer review process. If they all vote unanimously to accept, then we notify the family, we organize a whole burial ceremony, and then that service member is officially buried. For what I specialize in, it's the second type of cases, so identification of graves. And that's where the service member has already been buried. So for those cases, we cannot exhume them. We can't use DNA, we can't use isotopes, we can't use any of that kind of science support. And so these cases fall entirely to the history. And so these cases are ones where we have to do all this, like I called it, historical sleuthing, to kind of piece together the historical record to create a narrative of what happened that ultimately led that grave to potentially becoming unknown, so that we can try and figure out who are all the different candidates that could possibly be buried there. And then if we have a primary candidate, we have to not only confirm that it has to be him, but we also have to check to make sure it can't be anyone else. And so if we're able to kind of piece all those different things together, then we put that forward to the Casualty Identification Review Board. Again, it has to be voted unanimously. And if they decide to accept, we have a rededication ceremony, and we're able to notify the family and do the ceremony overseas. So 2 very different processes, but ultimately similar research methodology on my side. I've helped with both cases. The very first case I worked on from start to finish was Kenneth Donald Duncanson, who was an identification of remains case, a Second World War case that ultimately we were able to identify, must have been, 2017 or something like that, a few years ago now. And that case always holds a very near and dear place in my heart, just because it was the first case that I worked on, but also because there were so many artifacts found with the remains that not only assisted with the identification, but we were then able to give a lot of these artifacts, once they were restored, back to the family, as well as some artifacts to the regiment and some to museums. So it just had this really wide outreach. One of the more recent identification of graves cases that we just announced was that of Private Venance, another Second World War case. We actually don't do that many Second World War cases. These are just kind of little interesting examples, but this one we were just able to announce, and it took years. It was quite literally years in the making. And so the fact that we were able to call his family and let him know that it's been confirmed and it is him is, very, very, very emotional, I guess, experience for everyone involved. And I think his rededication ceremony is taking place in hopefully May. And I'm hoping that I'll actually be able to get overseas for the very first time and be at one of the ceremonies too. So very, very interesting process for both, but that's kind of the general overview.
It must be so meaningful to the families, Renee, that you're doing this work and that you're going to be able to go. It's so meaningful, I think, for a sense of closure for yourself as well, especially after so many years of work to see this all come together. If you could, this is making the news. Private Arthur Venance, can you share a little bit about his story?
Yeah, so Private Venance's story is one that is rather complicated and yet also straightforward. It's one where ultimately in February of 1945, his unit, the Lake Superior Regiment, 1st Battalion, they sent a little patrol out over the Mass River. It was an overnight patrol. They were very common. They were doing them a lot at this time. And he was part of the company that was chosen to go over, the B Company, and they came under fire. I mean, it happens all the time. They were trying to get a prisoner to bring back with them, and it just didn't work out. So he and a partner were manning a Bren gun machine. They were supposed to be kind of supporting the advancing position. And there's contradictory witness testimony, but it seems like at one point a German refused to surrender. He got shot, and then that brought about German machine guns firing down on the positions. So throughout the chaos that always ensues, the Lake Superiors are trying to pull back to get back across the river to safety. A few men see that the gentleman that was with Private Venance, Lance Corporal Hilderly, had been killed. And they saw that Private Venance was severely wounded, but they were unable to get him out because of how heavy the machine gun fire was. After a little while, a second group goes out to try and get them back. They want to get the body of Lance Corporal Hilderly, and they want to evacuate as many wounded as possible, but then they come under heavy fire. There's 3 officers that are taken prisoner during that and wounded. And then eventually one of them unfortunately passes away while he was receiving medical treatment in a German aid post. And then one of them is taken prisoner of war. And when he is released later in 1945, he kind of says, I don't think Private Venance survived. I don't remember seeing him even be evacuated. I think he died with Lance Corporal Hilderly. And so fast forward to the case, we have an independent researcher who submitted a research report from the Netherlands saying, I think I've figured out who this grave belongs to. The grave was an unknown Canadian soldier, no date of death, no unit, no real partial identifiers to help us figure out who it was. But this independent researcher had done a lot of digging and figured out that this grave had originally been concentrated from a different cemetery alongside that of an identified grave belonging to Lance Corporal Hilderley. And so they had been brought together over to Holton Canadian War Cemetery, along with the grave of the officer that had been killed trying to retrieve their bodies. He had been brought from a different cemetery altogether. He had been buried near the German aid post. And so anyway, these graves were concentrated side by side at Holton. And for whatever reason, the one grave was unidentified. And the independent researcher said, logically, it has to be Private Venance. He was with Hilderley. And so he submitted a case to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Well, to us as well. We kind of work in tandem. And frankly, everything kind of lined up to the point where you have to wonder why didn't he get identified from the beginning? But based on all the evidence in the personnel files, we pulled so many. We went through war diaries. We went through witness testimonial. It seemed likely that he died very, very shortly after Lance Corporal Hilderley, and the territory being occupied by the German forces, they likely just buried them where they fell. And whether there was an identifying marker or whether they just buried them and walked away, we'll never know. But for whatever reason, he became anonymous up until now. So through piecing all that together, we not only figured out that everything logically said it was Private Arthur Venance, but also I then did a deep dive to see if it was any of the 36 other missing Canadians from the Netherlands. I had to go through every war diary and personnel file to figure out where they all were when they were last at least seen to be alive, go through the witness testimony saying what happened. We were looking at river flow to see if the Mass River, if a body could have fallen in, could it have gone downstream, upstream, comparing all the known casualties as well as the unknown graves to figure out what the pattern was near the waterways. Very complicated case at the end of the day for what seems like a pretty straightforward story. But we were able to make it work. And I think the Casualty Identification Review Board agreed that it only makes sense that it's him. So we were able to just announce that, about 2 weeks ago. And now he's going to get his ceremony and soon he'll have his headstone.
I love hearing just the incredible amount of work and detail that goes into identifying this, because you got hours and hours and hours, days, I should say, probably, or months of research, going into it. Because, like you said, it's straightforward, but not, because it's straightforward enough. The researcher that had initially done the research pointed to it, but there's this due diligence I'm hearing that is so important, just to make sure that it's not like to the point you're looking at rivers, that it's making sure it's Private Arthur Venance himself and not someone that might have died, fallen into a river, been taken down. Like the process of elimination and going through war diaries and witness testimonies, I bet you create a bit of a connection with these individuals as you're researching.
You absolutely do. I have some student researchers that help me with these cases, and it's one of the things I tell them at the very beginning that they have to be aware of. You will form bonds with these men because at the end of the day, it's our job to learn everything we can about them, including what happens to them at the very end of their lives. And in many ways, that's really difficult. I mean, quite frankly, my job is to every day in and out research how men died, what happened to them, the horrors of it. But I try to tell them, and I tell myself, like, in so doing, I'm making sure their memory is kept alive. And if I can take that even further by bringing a name to their headstone, that's great. But even if not, if the case doesn't ultimately get accepted, which the vast majority of them don't, we can't bring them all together at the end, even if sometimes my gut says it's him, if I don't have all the evidence, right? Because of diligence, we don't move forward unless we're really, really sure, because we don't want to make a mistake. We never would want to, tell a family we've identified and then end up having to change that. So we only put forward when we're sure. And I just think that even if it doesn't lead to an identification the fact that I've done my deep dive into all of these different men that are involved, not even just the primary candidate, but like all the different candidates that even could be in the area. I'm bringing a little bit of life back to their story. I'm recognizing their death. I'm recognizing the sacrifice and the challenges and the pain that they went through. And I think in a way that's helping keep it alive. That's helping making sure that their story is still being told, even if it doesn't lead to that name on the headstone at the end of the day. So you form these very deep connections with them. The story I talked about in that very first case, Duncanson, when I worked at Vimy in 2017, I actually rented a bike from Bruges, and I biked out to his cemetery. I couldn't rent a car yet, but I biked out there because I just wanted to sit there. And I wrote him a letter, and I just sat at the grave because I felt like I knew him. He felt like family by that point because I had spent so much time looking into his case. And so, yeah, every one of them becomes that family member that you kind of connect with.
That's beautiful. And, as you're saying that, there's Vance, there's Duncanson. As you were talking, I pulled up both their pictures because I love being able to see the pictures. It humanizes people a little bit. Is there any story or anything about any of these soldiers, whether it's Vance or Duncanson or another one that hasn't been identified, that is just something that's stood out to you or is close to your heart that you'd like to share?
I think Duncanson just has a soft place for me because one of the things that we found with his remains that helped us to identify him was he was wearing, well, in pictures we had found of him, he was wearing a bracelet. And the set of remains didn't initially appear to have a bracelet on him. But as they were digging more and more and they found all these artifacts, they ended up finding a tobacco box, a snuff box that had, when they tried to open it, something inside. And as part of the conservation efforts, they were able to pull out this silver bracelet. And it was pristine because the tobacco had basically formed this glob around it that preserved it despite the years in the mud and the water. And so they were able to clean the tobacco off. And it was a little bracelet from his wife, Lillian, and it said, "Love, Lillian." And then on the other side, it was his service number and his name. And so although we already felt pretty confident in the identity, when that bracelet came to light, we were ecstatic, but also heartbroken because he had, his wife had bought that for him. It was a way of not only keeping him safe, but reminding him of her and that she was thinking of him. And it just, it hit so hard. And to this day, when I on occasion go and look at his pictures and stuff and seeing him wear the bracelet in the photos and know that we found that bracelet and we're able to return it to the family, obviously he didn't come home and that's horrifying. But the fact that we could give that back just hit so hard. And even now I get emotional thinking about it. So there are lots of little stories that definitely stand out. And there are some for cases that don't go forward too, that there's just little tidbits that you kind of always think back on.
As you're talking, I'm scrolling through those pictures. I'm looking at that bracelet. I'm seeing his wedding ring, a picture of him and his wife. Makes me emotional seeing that, and just that smile and him sitting holding a horse and everything. It's I can imagine the bond you have there, and it just, again, it reminds me of the work you're doing and why it's so important and sharing stories, because one of the things I found going overseas and visiting some of these sites, whether you're going through Tynecott or Grosbeak or Holton, all of these sites, there's just thousands and thousands of headstones, and you almost become numb to them. And you see that, there's a name on there, and you could pass a headstone that says Private Keith Donald Duncanson, and we don't recognize always that there's this huge story. There's this family, this wife that lost her husband, and a family and the grief there. And it's so important to be able to reconnect to that story. And this is why I think what you're doing is such a amazing service, because in the past, that headstone would have said "unknown unto God." And now it says his name. And now even further to that, with technology and the availability of information, we can humanize them, which is a big part of what we're trying to do at Memory Anchor is just give those stories back. And yeah, I'm just, I don't even know what my question is. I'm just feeling that emotion and reflecting it back. I think it's just such an amazing thing you're doing. We'll make sure to save and share to the show notes so our listeners can click on this link and see the bio and the work that you've done.
We always make a point of writing a biography for every one of the soldiers we identify. Whether people ever read it or not, I think it always just adds that much more of a human character to them. There are some that we can't ever find photos for, which is always a little bit sad, but the vast majority of the time when we reach out to family, they do have photos, they have stories, they have letters that they can share, and we'll include those on the bio pages whenever we can.
Renee, you were mentioning earlier you regularly work with other agencies and organizations. What does that look like when you're putting a case together?
Yeah, so cases are kind of brought to us in a few different ways. Identification of remains cases are usually initiated by often the construction companies that call the cops saying, hey, we found some bones. And then they notify Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who has a team based in France that will go out and actually make sure that the remains are properly excavated and everything else well documented, of course. Also making sure that no one takes any of the artifacts or anything that they shouldn't be taking. And then Commonwealth War Graves Commission will do their analysis and send us a report letting us know that someone has been found. So that we can start the research on our side of figuring out who was fighting in the area, who was missing, were there aviators flying overhead that may have crashed, et cetera, et cetera. And then we work in tandem with them, with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, to ultimately bring the case to its conclusion. With the identification of graves cases, they are entirely dependent on independent researchers submitting research reports to us or the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, letting us know that there's a headstone that may be identified. So these are people who are purely out of the goodness of their hearts taking an interest in some of these headstones, delving into what we usually call partially identified headstones. So one where there is maybe a date of death or a unit identifier, but not a name. And they're starting to research. They're starting to look into, was that an original grave or was it concentrated? Who was in the area where that grave was originally exhumed, who's missing, et cetera, et cetera. And then they take the time to put a report together to then submit to say, hey, it may be this person, or even if they don't have a primary candidate, there may be enough here to try to identify this grave. And so we are so reliant on those people submitting the reports and so grateful for the work that they do. And then again, Commonwealth War Graves Commission and Directorate of History and Heritage conduct our own analysis into the cases. And we use a lot of sources now held by Library and Archives Canada, so they're a big partner. And then we work with Veterans Affairs Canada for the ceremonies as well, and the Canadian military for notifying families and whatnot. So it's a massive group effort to ultimately bring these cases to the close.
It sounds like a real community that comes around these cases to see them through. It sounds like, and I may be wrong, it sounds like you're attending your first ceremony this year. Is that right?
I am absolutely hoping to. Now that I'm based in the UK, I am set on getting overseas to see either a rededication ceremony for one of the cases we just announced or the burial ceremony for a case that we announced a few months ago. I was also talking with our British counterparts from MOD War Detectives just yesterday, and they said if I can't get overseas for Canadian burial or rededication, I'm welcome to go to theirs. So one way, shape, or form, I'm going to a ceremony while I can. So.
We'll keep your fingers crossed, and I think that would be really special. I was going to ask, what do you think it means to the families too? Because sometimes they are able to attend if they're able to find next of kin. What do you hear from families when you've confirmed somebody has been found?
It's always a huge mix of emotion, but oddly enough, I would say the vast majority of the time it's joy, which is kind of hard to explain to people, that when we can kind of confirm that we've been able to identify someone who was ultimately a family member who was killed and lost and missing for so long, they greet that news with joy and happiness. And that's because I think it finally gives the family closure. And it doesn't matter how long it's taken, the fact that we were able to give them that closure is always met with such joy. Now, at the ceremonies themselves, from what I've been told by my military colleagues and the program head, there is, of course, sadness. I mean, you can't help but feel a lot of overwhelming grief when you're standing in the cemetery itself, when you're seeing that casket lower into the grave, or when the new headstone is being rededicated. But that's, I think, part of why we do those ceremonies. We want to still recognize that this was a loss and that this individual fought and died for their country, and that needs to be recognized. But even with the service members who are sent to participate in the ceremonies, you can see that weight, but also the joy in recognizing that was one of their fallen. This is someone from their unit, or their unit perpetuates that unit, and they're able to be there to honor that sacrifice. And so you can see how much meaning that holds for even the members in uniform to this day. So it's a huge mix of emotion at the ceremonies. And frankly, I think the families in particular hold that for a long, long time. Even after they get back from the trip, they still they reach out to us. They often let us know if they found more information, or if some of the family has reconnected because of this whole experience. They let us know. And so then it becomes this kind of legacy impact.
It's beautiful work that you're doing. I wanted to ask, do you have any current cases, any appeals for relatives ongoing that you would want to share?
I currently have 33 open cases, and we have over 30 identification of remains cases open as well. So we do have a registration form on our website. If you think that you may at some point be related to a missing service member, please register on our website so that we don't have to look nearly as hard to try and find you. Yeah, actually, if you Google Canadian Casualty Identification or even Casualty Identification, we're the very first ones that pop up. So register on there. Otherwise, my call out is primarily to people, if they're walking through the cemeteries and they see a partially identified headstone, let us know, because that's the only way most of these cases really get going, is people telling us about it. And so again, through our website, you can access us and you can tell us the different stories. And hopefully through that, we'll have many, many more cases to keep working on for the future.
And for Private Arthur Venance, will the ceremony be open to members of the public that are around? How does that work?
So the ceremony itself, it will hopefully take place in May. We're still working out the details with the family's availability and the unit and everything else. But it will be updated on his biography. At the bottom of the webpage, it'll tell you when the date is announced. Anyone from the public is welcome to come. The family will be there. The unit will be there. Wow. His will be a rededication ceremony. So it's a little bit different because he's already been buried. And so he did already have kind of a full ceremony. So this is a different style, I guess, to just ultimately recognize his name. And then for identification of remains cases, there is a full ceremony as well. A full burial ceremony where a casket is brought over from Canada. He's interred in that casket, and we do this bigger entrance, let's say, because ultimately we are now burying him. And again, members of the public are more than welcome to attend. It's always nice. Every ceremony, there's Canadians that travel from far and wide to visit, but there's also the locals, the people that are from that area that grew up around that cemetery that make a point of coming and honoring them. And yeah, it's just so impactful no matter how big or small.
Renee, this has just been such a treat just to sit and talk and hear a little bit more about everything you're doing. As we wrap up here, is there any final thoughts or anything you'd like to point the public's attention to?
I guess the thing I would want to just get across is how much you can learn from the individual stories in the cemeteries and the names on the monuments. To take the time to look into some of these stories, to research, so that, as you had mentioned earlier, it's not just a name on a headstone anymore. I always try to tell everyone I can that the headstones tell a story. And whether it's the story of that cemetery or whether it's the story of a unit or a specific battle, you can learn so much by just taking an extra moment to kind of delve into the deeper details of the headstone. And that headstone, it's there to mark an individual. And so there's even more stories that come from it. So I guess I would want to encourage people to foster curiosity in the cemeteries, in the sites, and in the stories behind all of this commemorative effort, because it's an ongoing process of remembering the First World War, but it's something that's still evolving to this day. And I think there's just, I don't know, there's a beauty in that. And so I want other people to hopefully be inspired to keep looking into that story a bit more.
Well, it's clear when you talk and you speak about this, your passion comes through, and that is often enough to ignite the passion in others. And so, yes, please, everyone, if you do have a chance to get to some of these cemeteries, take a look at it and be curious. And I think that curiosity is what can lead to some pretty phenomenal discoveries, whether that's just your own understanding of these conflicts and individuals. Renee, thank you so much for just sharing your passion and just the history and how you ended up doing what you're doing. And thank you most significantly for your service to the memory of these individuals, because it does them such a justice. And for us who are left, we can learn so much from them. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for letting me share the stories and talk about the program. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd enjoyed the episode, please like and share. Check out our socials on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and join us again next week.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Story Behind the Stone is available on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on the Wreaths Across America radio network, on iHeartRadio, Audacity, and TuneIn. Just search for Wreath. We air every Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern on the Wreaths Across Radio Network. Thank you for tuning in.